empirical things is only a distinction according to the degree of clarity of the representations. This makes Kant say that Leibniz only knows things in general. And these things in general are on the one hand represented confusedly as spatiotemporal by the senses, and on the other hand, well, let's say ideally are represented in their absolute intelligible clarity by pure understanding, which is only ultimately accessible for the divine standpoint. This is why, on this point, Kant can reduce the Leibnizian position to Platonism. And this is something we find in a reflection by Kant, which he wrote down in years preceding the first critique, so 76, 78. You find it on the next slide. Yeah. So, acquisitae, so something that you have gotten into possession of, are a priori or a posteriori acquisitae. The former are not always intellectual, so that's already a critique of Kant. What is a priori is not always intellectual. So it is not a distinction between sensory and intellectual cognition that comes first, but the distinction between a priori or a posteriori cognition. A priori cognition is either sensitive or intellectual. But Plato took all a priori cognition to be intellectual, and so did Leibniz. And as a consequence, they did not know the sensible nature of space and time. Leibniz also declares them, so them, space and time, to be intellectual, but confused. The problem is, of course, that how can we have an a priori representation of space? That's Kant's option. If space and time were only based on relations of, this is the problem we get in Leibniz. If space and time were only based on relations between things, it would be impossible to be in possession of such an a priori representation. So if the confused representation that you have of space, in Leibniz's view, it corresponds ideally on the intellectual true realm of things, it is an expression of relation between intellectual things, between moments. But this means we can't have an a priori representation of space, because a priori, if everything a priori is intellectual, as Leibniz takes it to be, well then he couldn't explain how there is still such representation, because on the intellectual level there would be nothing left. You would only have the intellectual substances, and you can't have the representation isolated, say, of this relation between intellectual substances. And this is a problem, because even if Leibnizians take geometry to be a rational science, so an intellectual science that is, in Kant's terminology, it would be synthetic a priori, geometry, but also that is Kant's view. It's not as simple as that. So, of course, you have authors that also defend that for Leibniz. It's analytic, totally analytic. But the problem for Kant is that he thinks he has shown that geometry is synthetic a priori, and therefore you need an a priori intuition of space. And if you can't understand how you get at such a representation, you can't explain the scientificity of geometry. But enough on Leibniz and Newton. Let's go to the next part. So, what does Kant say about space? Well, Kant, in the Critique of Pure Reason, gives a metaphysical exposition of space. And this is, as Kant terms it, it is an analysis of our given concept of space. Now, to be short, the result of this analysis is that space is a priori that's the outcome, let's say, of the metaphysical exposition. So the outcome of Kant's analysis, philosophical analysis of space. I won't go now into the details of these arguments, but this is not very controversial, so I don't feel the need to defend this here. So in Kant's opinion, he can, after his analysis of the concept of space, he finds that space is a priori, that it is necessary, that in its relation to outer objects, it is more fundamental than these outer objects. He also finds that it is originally intuitive and not conceptual. So this is a small paradox, you could say. You analyze a given concept and you find that originally it's not a concept, but it's an intuition. Now, space is also absolutely homogeneous, and this means that all parts of space are equal. It's more technical than that, but this suffices for now. And space is also represented as actually and not merely potentially infinite. So it's represented, Kant says, as a given infinite magnitude. Now, which is kind of astonishing if you look to the outcome of Kant's analysis of space, is that it doesn't contain the much more famous thesis of Kant that it is a form. So if you look into his metaphysical exposition, Kant nowhere says space is a form of intuition. So he says it's intuitive and not conceptual, but the word form doesn't appear. And so it seems we need an argument now on the basis of this outcome of Kant's analysis of space to argue, well, because of these properties, so to say, of space, we need to characterize it as a form. So this is not a result of the analysis of the concept of space. And so if we specifically look for Kant's argument, where does he argue that following these properties of space that he found through philosophical analysis must be a form? The argument is implicitly given in the beginning of the transcendental exposition, well, the beginning of the third paragraph of the transcendental exposition. So you first have in the second edition of the Critique, Kant makes a distinction between metaphysical exposition and transcendental exposition. In the transcendental exposition, he shows how his conception of space can lay the ground for geometry. So it explains how geometry as a specific form of a priori cognition can rely on space as an a priori intuition. No? Yeah. So this is the passage from the transcendental exposition. Kant says, because the receptivity of the subject to be affected by objects necessarily precedes all intuitions of these objects, we can understand how the form of all phenomena could be given before all real perceptions, and therefore a priori in the mind, and how, as a pure intuition, in which all objects must be determined, it can contain principles of the relations between them before all actual experience. Now, this is a quite complex passage. And I would like to remark that I think that in this passage from the Aesthetic, which we find already in the first edition of the Critique of Pure Reason, the difference that is later explicitly introduced in the analytic, the difference between form of intuition and formal intuition, is already implicitly contained. Why? Well, because on the one hand, you have here the conception of originary space as pure outer intuiting, you could say, das reine äußere Anschauung, or the pure external Anschauungsvermögen. So this originary space is not really an intuition itself. It's also not to be called the object of an intuition, because it can't be consciously represented. It is this originary space that Kant calls the subjective form of outer sense in general. But on the other hand, this originary space can also be objectified. And this happens when the a priori manifold of space as a subjective form is synthesized, so taken together, in order to give us an a priori intuition in which the outer objects can be determined. And they can be determined a priori. Why? Well, because all objects, outer objects, have to be spatial objects. So in a sense, this is quite close to Newton's conception. But of course, you have the big changes that Kant makes this kind of absolute space into a subjective characteristic. So it's part of human sensibility. So when we synthesize the a priori manifold, whatever that is, so Kant says the form of intuition contains an a priori manifold. And we can take this a priori manifold together, we can synthesize it, and this gives us an a priori intuition in which we can discover the spatial characteristics of objects. So we can determine a priori how outer objects will have to be once we possess the a priori intuition of space. We can discover the a priori laws that are valid for the relations of outer objects to each other, so the spatial relations. And as such, space is a formal intuition. Because now it is by how do we take together this a priori manifold of space? Well, Kant says that this we do by an act of transcendental imagination. And this turns the form of intuition into an intuition itself. And because you have here transcendental imagination at work, Kant calls space also an ens imaginarium, so a thing of the imagination, an imagined entity. This is not to say that space is fictional, or the ens imaginarium refers to the objectified space. And objectifying space is what is done by transcendental imagination. Now, the question I have here is, there's only this quite implicit or very implicit argument to state that space is a form. And you can read several times the Aesthetic, but so there's a section after the transcendental exposition which says, well, the conclusions from these concepts, Kant calls it, but he means the conclusions from the metaphysical exposition, so from this analysis of space. And in these conclusions then he says explicitly, well, space is a form, but without really any further argument. And that's why I would like to know something more about this distinction between matter and form as here as metaphysical concepts to characterize an entity that you analyze, philosophically analyze. And I think that one of the most clear passages where Kant speaks about matter and form in a very general sense is to be found in the amphiboly of the concepts of reflection. And so the fifth part of my paper is about this amphiboly which describes the transcendental reflection and also says something about the distinction between matter and form as philosophical concepts. Now, what is transcendental reflection as opposed to logical reflection? Well, transcendental reflection, Kant says, is the action through which I make a comparison of representations in general with the cognitive power in which they are situated, and through which I distinguish whether they are to be compared to one another as belonging to the pure understanding or to pure intuition. So this action of comparison of representations is called transcendental reflection. Through transcendental reflection, we assign a position to a concept. Not a spatial position in this case, but let's say a position in your metaphysical system. You assign a position of a concept either in sensibility or in the understanding. So if you have a given concept, that's Kant's terminology for space. He says, well, it's a concept we receive through metaphysical, through the tradition of philosophy. It was analyzed in former metaphysics, and people like Leibniz and Newton had different opinions, as we have seen, but we receive from the tradition certain concepts. And what is new, says Kant, in my system is that I will first ask this concept that I get here and that people speak about, does it belong to sensibility, or originally does it belong to sensibility or to the understanding? So if we do this action, this transcendental reflection with respect to a particular representation, it will result in the determination of what Kant calls its transcendental place, topos. The transcendental reflection is, as Kant claims, a duty for philosophers, a duty from which no one can escape if he would judge anything about things a priori. So, the error of former metaphysicians is that they didn't do this transcendental reflection, and so they thought that they were able to judge a priori about things without assigning their transcendental place. Now, the possible relations in which concepts in a state of mind can belong together, or these are the concepts, so-called concepts of reflection. We have identity, difference, agreement, opposition, inner, outer, and then the fourth, which is linked with, so these are these four pairs of concepts of reflection. Of course, Kant links them to the titles of the categories. And the fourth pair of concepts of reflection is the distinction between matter and form. Metaphysically speaking, these concepts express the determinable, so matter is the determinable in general, and form is the determination. Now, if you have a certain concept and you need to philosophically analyze it, the correct determination of all the possible relations depends, says Kant, on the cognitive power in which the concepts belong together. And the difference between these four pairs of concepts of reflection is that, as is always the case, is that modality is a special case. And why is this so? Well, Kant says form and matter, these are two concepts that ground all other reflection. So inseparably are they bound up with every use of the understanding. And so we learn that form and matter, which are as concepts of reflection associated with modality, they help us to determine the transcendental topos of philosophical concepts. And how do you do this? Well, you do this transcendental reflection, for example, with space, and you will have to claim that they are matter or form with respect to our cognizing self. But we don't have to illustrate this immediately with space. We can take other concepts in Kant's philosophy. For example, take empirical manifold of intuition, or just short, an empirical intuition. If you exert this action, so you will modally determine the concept of empirical intuition, then you find that it has always to be considered as matter. So it's always matter with respect to our cognizing self. If you take, on the other hand, the concept of category, which is of course also a traditional concept, well, if you ask yourself, with respect to our cognizing self, category, is that matter or form? Well, you have to consider that it's form. Category is not matter itself with respect to our cognizing self. The difficulty now is indeed to effectuate such a transcendental reflection when it comes to the philosophically revolutionary concept of an a priori intuition. And that's what comes out from metaphysical exposition. So the analysis of the concept of space has shown space originally is an a priori intuition. Now, if you try to do this transcendental reflection with respect to this concept, which is new in the history of philosophy, an a priori intuition, well, you must concede that it's neither only form or nor only matter to the cognizing self. So it puts us before a certain problem. We can't easily execute this action, this transcendental reflection, that is so basically involved in our work as Kantian critical metaphysicians. Now, what is the solution to this problem? Well, instead of defining transcendental reflection as the determination of something as form of matter with respect to our cognizing self in general, Kant says we have forged a new distinction, namely the distinction between pure sensibility and understanding. And what is typical and revolutionary for that is both are a priori realms, so that were traditionally intellectual only. And so by opening some kind of new power in the cognizing self, namely pure sensibility, you open up a new field in which a modal transcendental reflection, so that determines the transcendental topos, the transcendental place of this concept, can actually succeed. Instead of sticking to the distinction between the cognizing self and, for example, the empirical intuition, so there you don't need to distinguish in the cognizing self itself between different capacities. Here you must anchor the distinction between matter and form you must anchor it in another distinction, namely the one between understanding and pure sensibility. This is quite abstract, I know it, but let's take the other examples and do anew the transcendental reflection by taking into account this new distinction between pure sensibility and pure understanding. Take an empirical intuition and ask, is it matter or form with respect to pure intuition? You have to say it's matter with respect to pure intuition. But it's also matter with respect to the understanding. So the result doesn't change. So what we found by just determining its transcendental place, whether it's matter or form, with respect to the cognizing self in general, the result was, well, empirical intuitions are always matter. This doesn't change if you divide now the cognizing self in pure sensibility and pure understanding. It remains matter. The same goes for the concept of category. If you ask, with respect to the understanding, pure understanding, is the concept of a category, is it matter or is it form? This is kind of a difficult question, philosophically speaking, but it's clear that Kant would consider it's a form of the understanding. That's his characterization. You could argue, well, in some way it's given by the understanding, but that's something Kant doesn't say. So it's, he doesn't characterize, he never characterizes the category as matter of the understanding. And of course, when we speak about pure intuition, the category is also a form. With respect to space, because of the result of a metaphysical exposition, which combines the concept of intuition, traditionally being only sensible and not a priori, so this new kind of capacity in human beings to have this pure sensibility, you need to be more nuanced in your transcendental reflection with respect to space. On the one hand, with respect to pure sensibility, you have to say space is a form. It's a form of pure sensibility. But with respect to pure understanding, it is matter. So you get the division, the opening up of the cognizing subject in pure sensibility and pure understanding gives a double result for Kant's conception of space. Its form of pure sensibility, but it also gives the understanding, as Kant literally says in the beginning of the Transcendental Analytic, matter and time provide us with a priori matter. They provide an a priori matter for the understanding. How am I doing with time? Okay.
But if you can show me it.
Yeah. Yeah, I will try to conclude. So I know this is quite abstract, but I think it's quite fundamental too, because these kind of questions we tend to not ask, and we have all learned that for Kant space is a form of intuition, but if then actually you look where is the argument, it's more difficult than you assume. And I think the connection that Kant provides between empirical realism on the one hand, empirical realism of space, and transcendental idealism of space on the other hand, this connection that he needs a double metaphysical characterization of space reflects the fact that he needs to characterize it both as matter and as form. Matter as a formal intuition, so which is the a priori manifold given by the form of space. Well, then to conclude, let's go to the next slide. Yeah, that's I have read it. So, and this is some kind of, that's the systematic approach. This is not something that Kant says somewhere, but I think if you have to characterize space, you have to deal with something that is not an object in the proper sense. It's not, space is not something like a chair or a table. So it's clearly a metaphysical object, quasi-object in a philosophical system. Patricia, can you give the next slide? So, and that is a little bit to please Joël, that I connect this with an analysis that I have done some years ago in a talk I gave in Madrid, where I met for the first time Joël. I think also Sylvia was present. What is remarkable is that Kant has the table of nothing, but this is not nothing as absolutely nothing. And in this table of nothing, you find a lot of concepts that Kant actually uses in his philosophy, namely space, time, also the thing in itself, the ens rationis, but also the unding, the nihil negativum. So this is the table of nothing, and absolutely nothing is well, most approaches absolutely nothing is form, namely an empty object without concept, the nihil negativum. And can you give the next slide, please? So, well, I'm going very fast now, but I think the fact that we deal here with a strange object, Kant says himself, space is an ens imaginarium, so the third kind of nothing. And space as an a priori matter for the understanding